Sometimes the most unexpected friendships are born from the deepest pain. In the vast wilderness of the American West, two lost souls were about to find each other in the most unlikely way. Jake Miller had been riding these canyon trails for over 20 years, but he'd never seen anything like this. A young mountain lion cub was following him, keeping its distance but never leaving his side. At first, Jake thought it was stalking him, waiting for the right moment to attack. But as the hours passed, he began to notice something different. In the cub's eyes, not hunger for prey, but desperation for help. The little cat was starving, alone and scared. When Jake finally understood what had happened to the cub's family, the truth broke his heart. What would you do if faced with such an impossible choice between safety and compassion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust as Jake Miller guided his horse, Thunder, along the familiar ridge trail. At 58, Jake moved with the practiced ease of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than most people spent behind a desk. His weathered hands, marked by decades of ranch work and desert sun, held the reins with gentle authority. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, much like everything else in Jake's carefully ordered life. The Double J Ranch stretched across 1,200 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving land in southern Utah. Jake had inherited it from his father, who had received it from his father before him. 3 generations of Miller men had worked this land, raised cattle, and learned to read the subtle language of wind, weather, and wildlife that spoke to those patient enough to listen. This morning's ride was part of Jake's weekly routine: checking fence lines, counting cattle, and simply being present in the landscape that had shaped him. He pulled a small leather journal from his shirt pocket, its brown cover soft and pliable from years of handling. Every significant observation went into this journal: changes in animal behavior, weather patterns, the health of his herd. His father had kept similar notes, and his grandfather before him. It was more than record-keeping. It was a conversation, across generations, a way of honoring the accumulated wisdom of those who had walked these trails before him. Thunder snorted and shook his head, ears pricking forward at something Jake couldn't yet see. The horse was 15 years old, a bay, gelding with intelligence in his dark eyes and an uncanny ability to sense things before his rider did. They had been partners for a decade, and Jake trusted the animal's instincts as much as his own. "What is it, boy?" Jake murmured, scanning the horizon. The canyon opened up before them, a vast amphitheater of red rock and sagebrush that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. It was the kind of country that made a man feel both significant and utterly small at the same time. Jake's cell phone had no signal out here, which was exactly how he preferred it. The modern world, with its constant demands and digital urgencies, felt like a foreign country to him. He had adapted when necessary. The ranch required computers for record-keeping and mobile phones for emergencies, but he had never learned to love the technology the way younger folks seemed to. Out here with just his horse and the endless sky, he felt most like himself. The trail wound through a stand of pinyon pines, their needles releasing a resinous fragrance in the warming air. Jake paused to let Thunder drink from a small stream that bubbled up from underground springs. The water was cold and clear, tasting of minerals and mountain snow. He filled his canteen and took a long drink himself, grateful for the simple pleasure of clean water and shade. His thoughts drifted, as they often did on these solitary rides, to his late wife, Carol. She had been gone 4 years now, claimed by cancer that had moved through her body with ruthless efficiency, despite the best efforts of doctors in Salt Lake City. The grief had settled into something more manageable now, less like a knife wound and more like an old ache that flared up during weather changes. Still, he missed their conversations, missed her laughter, missed the way she could read his moods. and know exactly when to offer comfort or simply give him space. Carol had understood his need for these solitary rides. She had been raised on a ranch herself in Wyoming and knew that some men processed the world better in silence and solitude. She never made him feel guilty for spending hours away from the house, checking on cattle that were probably fine or riding fence lines that had been secure the day before. She understood that these rides were as much about his soul as they were about ranch management. Their daughter, Sarah, lived in Denver now with her own family. She was a successful architect, designing buildings that reached toward the sky instead of hugging the earth, like the low-slung ranch house where she had grown up. She visited when she could, bringing her 2 children, Jake's grandchildren, for a week each summer. Those visits were precious, but they also reminded him of how quiet the house had become. Jake opened his journal and made a quick note about the stream level. It seemed lower than usual for this time of year, which could mean a dry summer ahead. He would need to keep a closer eye on the cattle's access to water. These small observations, accumulated over years, had saved him from countless problems. His grandfather had taught him that the land spoke to those who knew how to listen, and the conversation was always worth having. The old man had been full of such wisdom. "Never rush nature," he used to say. "She'll tell you what you need to. No, but only when you're ready to hear it." Jake had been perhaps 25 when he first understood what his grandfather meant. It wasn't just about predicting weather or knowing when to plant. It was about developing a patience and attentiveness that served a man well in all aspects of life. Thunder finished drinking and lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle. The horse's ears were still forward, still alert to something that hadn't yet revealed itself. Jake trusted that instinct completely. In his experience, animals knew things that humans missed, picking up on subtle changes in scent or sound that escaped human senses. The ranch employed 2 full-time hands, Miguel Santos, who had been with the outfit for 15 years, and his nephew Carlos, who was learning the trade. Both men were skilled and trustworthy, which allowed Jake the freedom to take these long rides without worrying about daily operations. Miguel, in particular, had become more of a partner than an employee, offering insights and suggestions that Jake valued highly. But today was Jake's day off, if such a thing truly existed for a rancher. Miguel was handling the morning chores, and Carlos was repairing a section of fence in the north pasture. Jake had left before dawn, as was his custom, carrying only his journal, his canteen, and the simple pleasure of being alone with his thoughts and his horse. The country opened up again as they climbed higher, revealing a vista that never failed to take Jake's breath away. Mesas rose like ancient temples in the distance, their flat tops crowned with clouds that cast moving shadows across the valley floor. This was the landscape that had shaped 3 generations of his family, teaching them patience, resilience, and respect for forces greater than themselves. Jake pulled out his journal again and began to write, documenting not just the practical observations of a rancher, but something of what he felt in this moment. "The land endures," he wrote in his careful handwriting. "We are temporary caretakers, here for a brief time to tend and protect what will outlast us all." It was the kind of sentiment that might have embarrassed him if anyone else had read it. But the journal was private, a place where he could be honest about the deeper meanings he found in his daily work. As they moved higher up the trail, Jake found himself thinking about legacy. What would happen to the ranch when he was gone? Sarah had made it clear that she wouldn't be returning to run it. Her life was in the city now, her children growing up with concrete and traffic instead of sagebrush and silence. The thought didn't sadden him exactly. He wanted her to follow her own path. But it did raise questions about the future of something that had been built with love and sustained with sacrifice across 3 generations. Perhaps Miguel would be interested in buying the operation, or maybe they could work out some kind of partnership arrangement. The man certainly knew the land as well as Jake did, and his family had put down roots in the community. It was something to consider, though not something that required immediate decision. Jake was healthy and planned to work for many more years. Thunders, steady hoofbeats created a rhythm that was almost meditative, and Jake found his mind settling into the peaceful alertness that these rides always brought him. This was where he felt most connected to the long line of men who had worked this land before him, most aware of his place in the larger story of human presence in this magnificent and challenging landscape. It was Thunder who sensed it first. The horse's ears snapped forward like radar dishes, and his muscles tensed beneath Jake. They had crested a small rise where the trail split, one path leading down into Willow Creek Canyon, the other continuing along the ridge toward the old line shack. Jake was reaching for his journal to note the condition of a weathered trail marker when Thunder suddenly stopped, refusing to move forward despite Jake's gentle urging. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his hand moving instinctively to pat the horse's neck. In 20 years of riding this country, he had learned to trust Thunder's instincts completely. The horse had warned him of rattlesnakes coiled in shade, loose rocks that could cause a dangerous fall, and once, memorably, a black bear with cubs foraging in a berry patch just around a blind curve. Jake scanned the landscape ahead, his experienced eyes moving methodically across the terrain. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of mist from the canyon below. Everything appeared normal. The familiar arrangement of red rock formations, the scattered pinyon pines, the carpet of sagebrush stretching toward distant mesas. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement among the rocks, perhaps 50 yards ahead. At first, Jake thought it might be a deer or elk, but the movement was wrong. Too low to the ground, too fluid. His hand moved unconsciously to the rifle secured in its scabbard along Thunder's flank. In this country, a man learned to be prepared for anything. The movement came again, and this time Jake's breath caught in his throat. A young mountain lion emerged from behind a boulder, its tawny coat catching the sunlight. The animal was small, clearly a cub, probably no more than 4 or 5 months old. It stood motionless for a moment, watching them with large amber eyes, then took several hesitant steps forward. Jake's first instinct was pure alarm. Mountain lions, even young ones, were not to be taken lightly. He had encountered adult cats twice in his years on the ranch, and both times had ended with him and Thunder retreating while the big cats watched from rocky perches above. A mother with cubs was particularly dangerous, and Jake's eyes immediately began searching the surrounding rocks for signs of an adult cat, but something was wrong with this picture. The cub's movements were unsteady, almost hesitant. Instead of the confident grace Jake associated with mountain lions, this young animal moved with what looked like exhaustion. Its head hung low, and even from a distance, Jake could see that its ribs were showing beneath its coat. "Where's your mama, little one?" Jake whispered, more to himself than to the cub. Mountain lion mothers were notoriously protective of their young, rarely allowing them to wander far from supervision. The fact that this cub was alone and clearly struggling set off alarm bells in Jake's mind. Thunder snorted and took a step backward, but his ears remained forward, focused on the cub rather than scanning for additional threats. The horse's behavior was strange too, alert but not panicked, as if he sensed that this particular predator posed no immediate danger. The cub took another few steps toward them, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't normal behavior. Mountain lions were naturally secretive animals, avoiding human contact whenever possible. For a cub to approach them so openly suggested either extreme desperation or something seriously wrong. Jake slowly reached for his binoculars, moving carefully to avoid startling either Thunder or the cub. Through the magnified lenses, the animal's condition became heartbreakingly clear. The cub was severely underweight, its coat dull and matted. Its eyes, though still alert, held a desperate quality that Jake recognized from years of working with animals. This was the look of a creature pushed to the very edge of survival. "Jesus," Jake breathed, lowering the binoculars. The cub couldn't weigh more than 25 pounds, far too light for an animal of its apparent age. It should have been sleek and healthy, learning to hunt under its mother's guidance. Instead, it looked like it hadn't eaten properly in days, possibly weeks. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Something had happened to the mother. Mountain lion cubs stayed with their mothers for up to 2 years, learning the complex skills necessary for survival in harsh country. Without that guidance and protection, this young animal was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. Disease, accident, illegal hunting. Any number of things could have claimed the mother's life. What mattered now was that her cub was alone and starving in country that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The cub took another step forward, and Jake noticed something that made his heart clench. The animal was looking directly at him, not with the wariness typical of wild creatures, but with something that looked almost like hope. It was as if the cub understood that Jake represented its only chance for survival. Thunder shifted beneath him, and Jake made a decision that went against 40 years of accumulated wisdom about dealing with wild predators. Instead of retreating or trying to scare the cub away, he dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Easy, boy," he said, addressing both Thunder and himself. The horse stood steady, though Jake could feel the animal's nervous energy through the reins. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." Jake took a step toward the cub, then another. The young mountain lion didn't flee. Instead, it sat down heavily, as if the effort of remaining upright was becoming too much. Up close, its condition was even more alarming. Jake could count every rib beneath its fur, and its eyes had the slightly sunken look of severe dehydration. "Lord help me," Jake whispered, pulling his journal from his pocket with shaking hands. He needed to document this, to record what he was seeing, but even as he opened the worn leather cover, he knew that no amount of careful notes could capture the emotional impact of this moment. The cub made a sound, not quite a meow, not quite a growl, but something plaintive and desperate that cut through Jake's defenses like a knife. It was the sound of an animal at the absolute end of its resources, appealing to the only source of help it could find. Jake had dealt with orphaned and injured animals before. Ranch life brought him into contact with creatures in distress regularly. Calves separated from their mothers, deer hit by vehicles, birds with broken wings. But this was different. This was a predator, an animal that would grow into something capable of killing livestock and potentially threatening human safety. Every rational part of his mind told him to back away, to let nature take its course, to remember the potential danger this animal represented. But looking into those amber eyes, seeing the desperate hope reflected there, Jake felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about wildlife management or ranch safety. This was about a young creature facing death through no fault of its own, reaching out for help in the only way it knew how. The cub made the sound again, softer this time, and took a hesitant step toward Jake. It was close enough now that he could have reached out and touched it, though he was far too experienced to attempt such a thing. Instead, he knelt slowly, bringing himself closer to the animal's level. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, little one," Jake said quietly. His voice seemed to calm the cub, whose ears pricked forward at the sound. "This isn't exactly covered in the rancher's handbook." Jake found himself thinking of Carol, wondering what she would have done in this situation. She had always been the one with the soft heart for strays and orphans, bringing home injured birds and abandoned kittens, despite Jake's protests about keeping wild things wild. "Everything deserves a chance," she used to say. "Sometimes we're the only chance they get." The memory hit him with unexpected force, and Jake felt tears stinging his eyes. 4 years after her death, he still found himself having conversations with her, still seeking her counsel on decisions both large and small. What would she say about this desperate young mountain lion looking to him for salvation? Jake knew the answer, and it both frightened and comforted him in equal measure. Jake spent the better part of an hour simply sitting with the cub, neither moving toward nor away from the desperate animal. The young mountain lion had settled into a patch of shade beside a boulder, its amber eyes never leaving Jake's face. Thunder grazed nearby, having apparently decided that this particular predator posed no immediate threat to his routine. The sun climbed higher, and Jake found himself facing a decision that seemed to have no good options. He couldn't leave the cub here to die. That much was clear from its condition. But bringing a mountain lion, even a young one, anywhere near the ranch presented problems he wasn't sure he was prepared to handle. Jake pulled out his cell phone, hoping against hope that he might catch a signal this high up the ridge. The screen showed no bars, as expected. He was on his own with this decision, at least for now. Part of him was relieved. Miguel would have strong opinions about bringing home a predator, and Jake wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The cub made another plaintive sound, and Jake felt his resolve crystallizing. "All right, little one," he said quietly. "I guess we're going to figure this out together." The first challenge was practical: how to transport a wild mountain lion cub without getting mauled in the process. Jake had a rope on his saddle, but the idea of trying to restrain the frightened animal seemed both cruel and potentially dangerous for all involved. Instead, he decided on a different approach. Moving slowly, Jake walked back to Thunder and retrieved a canvas tarp from his saddlebags, something he carried for emergencies. Though he had never imagined an emergency quite like this one. He spread the tarp on the ground between himself and the cub, then sat down at one edge, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "I know this is scary," Jake said, his voice low and soothing. "But you're going to have to trust me if we're going to help you." The cub watched him warily but didn't retreat. Jake reached into his lunch pack and pulled out a piece of jerky, not ideal food for a young mountain lion, but protein nonetheless. He tore off a small piece and tossed it gently toward the cub. The animal's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. It pounced on the morsel with desperate hunger, devouring it in seconds before looking back at Jake with unmistakable hope. Jake tore off another piece, this time placing it closer to the tarp. The cub hesitated only briefly before approaching and taking the food. Gradually, piece by piece, Jake coaxed the cub onto the tarp. The process took nearly an hour, but eventually the young animal was lying on the canvas, too exhausted to move much, but clearly trusting Jake enough to remain calm in his presence. The ride back to the ranch was unlike anything Jake had experienced. In 4 decades of ranching, he had wrapped the cub gently in the tarp, creating a makeshift carrier that he could secure to his saddle. The animal, weakened by hunger and perhaps sensing that help was finally at hand, offered no resistance. Thunder seemed to understand the unusual nature of their cargo, moving with exceptional care down the rocky trail. More than once, Jake found himself murmuring reassurances to both horse and passenger, though he wasn't entirely sure which of them needed the comfort more. As they approached the ranch, Jake's mind raced ahead to the challenges that lay before. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation facility was 3 hours away in Cedar City, but Jake doubted the cub was strong enough for such a journey. Besides, most wildlife facilities had strict policies about mountain lions, policies that often ended with euthanasia rather than rehabilitation. The ranch buildings came into view just as Miguel Santos emerged from the equipment barn, a wrench in his hand and a puzzled expression on his weathered face. Miguel was 15 years younger than Jake, with the build of a man who had spent his life doing physical work. He had come to the Double J from a ranch in New Mexico, following his sister Maria when she married a local teacher. Over the years, he had become far more than an employee. He was Jake's closest friend and most trusted advisor. "Jefe," Miguel called out, using the affectionate nickname he had adopted years ago. "You're back early. Everything all right?" Jake dismounted carefully, acutely aware of his precious cargo. "Miguel, I need you to prepare yourself for something unusual." Miguel approached, his experienced eyes immediately noting the awkward bundle secured to Jake's saddle. "What you got there, boss?" Something that's going to test both our judgment and our patience, Jake replied, beginning to untie the tarp. I found this little one up on the ridge trail. Looks like it's been on its own for a while. As Jake unwrapped the tarp, Miguel's eyes widened and he took an involuntary step backward. Jesus Christ, Jake, that's a mountain lion. A cub, Jake corrected, though he understood Miguel's alarm. And it's half-starved. Look at it, Miguel. Look at those ribs. Miguel was indeed looking, and Jake could see the internal struggle playing out on his friend's face. Miguel had grown up on ranches, where predators were viewed as threats to be eliminated, not rescued. At the same time, he was a man of deep compassion who had never been able to turn away from suffering, whether human or animal. "Where's the mother?" Miguel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Gone. Has to be, for this little one to be in this condition." Jake lifted the cub gently from the tarp. The animal was conscious but weak, offering no resistance to being handled. "Question is, what do we do now?" Miguel removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture Jake recognized as a sign of serious consideration. "You know what folks are going to say, don't you, about keeping a predator on the ranch?" "I know exactly what they'll say," Jake replied. "Same thing I'd probably say if I heard about someone else doing this. But Miguel, look at this animal. Really look at it." Miguel did look, and Jake saw the moment when practical considerations gave way to simple human compassion. The older man's shoulders sagged slightly, and he shook his head with a mixture of resignation and understanding. "Dios mío," Miguel muttered. "What have you gotten us into, amigo?" "I honestly don't know," Jake admitted, "but I couldn't leave it up there to die. Carol would never have forgiven me." The mention of Jake's late wife seemed to settle something for Miguel. He had loved Carol like a sister, and Jake's reference to her judgment carried weight that practical arguments could not match. "All right," Miguel said finally. "What do you need me to do?" "Help me get it settled somewhere safe while we figure out our next move, and Miguel, this stays between us for now. I don't want Carlos or anyone else knowing about this until we have a plan." Miguel nodded, understanding the delicate nature of their situation. Word traveled fast in their small community, and news of a mountain lion on the Double J Ranch would create complications they weren't ready to handle. Together, the two men carried the cub toward the ranch house, each lost in thought about the challenges they were about to face. The old equipment shed behind the main barn had been unused for years, storing only cobwebs and memories of Jake's father's era. But it was solid, dry, and could be secured, exactly what they needed for their unexpected guest. Miguel worked with quiet efficiency, clearing out decades of accumulated ranch detritus, while Jake drove into town for supplies. At Peterson's Feed and Supply, Jake found himself in the awkward position of purchasing items he couldn't fully explain. Milk replacer designed for orphaned calves, soft canned food meant for dogs, and a large dog crate that would provide temporary shelter. Mary Peterson, who had run the store for 30 years, raised an eyebrow at the unusual combination. "New dog, Jake?" she asked, ringing up his purchases with the practiced efficiency of small-town commerce. "Something like that," Jake replied, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Just helping out a friend with an animal in need." Mary's expression suggested she sensed there was more to the story, but she was wise enough not to press. In ranch country, people learned to mind their own business, especially when it came to questions that might not have comfortable answers. Back at the ranch, Jake found that Miguel had transformed the shed into something resembling a makeshift wildlife rehabilitation center. The concrete floor had been cleaned and covered with old horse blankets. A shallow water dish sat in one corner, and Miguel had even rigged up a heat lamp using an extension cord run from the barn. "Pretty fancy accommodations for a predator," Miguel observed, as they settled the cub into its new quarters. The young mountain lion immediately curled up under the heat lamp, its body finally beginning to relax for the first time since Jake had found it. "It's temporary," Jake said, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if that was true. "Just until we figure out what comes next." Miguel gave him a look that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of the temporary nature of their arrangement. "You know, my grandmother used to tell stories about people who raised wild animals. Never ended well, according to her." "This is different," Jake protested, though he wasn't entirely sure how. "This is about survival, not trying to make a pet out of something wild." They spent the next hour observing the cub and discussing immediate care needs. Jake's experience raising calves and caring for sick livestock provided some guidance, but mountain lions had specific nutritional requirements that neither man fully understood. Jake made a mental note to call Dr. Sarah Whitman, the veterinarian, who served their area. Sarah was young but knowledgeable, and more importantly, she was discreet. As evening approached, Carlos Santos, Miguel's nephew, returned from his fence repair work. At 22, Carlos had the enthusiasm of youth tempered by genuine respect for the land and the animals that lived on it. He was also, unfortunately, inclined to share interesting news with his friends in town. "Carlos," Miguel said as his nephew approached the shed. "We need to talk." Jake watched the young man's face as Miguel explained the situation. Carlos's eyes widened progressively as the story unfolded, and by the end, he was staring at the shed as if it contained a ticking. "Tío Miguel," Carlos said, reverting to Spanish in his excitement. "Estás loco? A mountain lion. Here." "Carlos," Jake interrupted gently, "I need you to understand something. This animal is not a threat right now. It's barely alive. But if word gets out about this, there will be people who want to make decisions about its future that might not be in anyone's best interest." Carlos looked back and forth between the two older men, clearly struggling with the implications. "But Jake, what if it gets bigger? What if it decides it likes cattle better than whatever you're feeding it?" "Those are fair questions," Jake acknowledged. "Questions we're going to have to answer as we go. But right now, our only concern is keeping it alive." Miguel placed a firm hand on his nephew's shoulder. "This stays between us, mijo. No talking. To your friends, no posting pictures on that Instagram thing. This is family business now." Carlos nodded slowly, though Jake could see the young man's mind racing with questions and concerns. "What about the sheriff? Don't we have to report something like this?" Jake had been dreading that particular question. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a good man and a longtime friend, but he was also bound by regulations that might not allow for the nuanced approach their situation required. "I'll handle that when the time comes," Jake said. "For now, we focus on basic care." As if responding to their conversation, the cub stirred and made a soft sound that was part purr, part whimper. Jake felt something tighten in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since Sarah was small and needed his comfort after nightmares. "It's going to need feeding soon," Miguel observed. "What exactly does a baby mountain lion eat?" Jake had been researching that question during his drive back from town, using his phone to access information that would have been unimaginable when he was starting out in ranching. "Milk replacer for now, mixed with some soft protein. Dr. Whitman will know more." The evening routine took on a surreal quality as they prepared the cub's first meal. Jake mixed the milk replacer according to package directions, while Miguel held the animal, both men moving with the careful attention usually reserved for newborn calves. The cub was weak, but alert enough to nurse from a bottle, its tiny paws kneading against Jake's forearm as it fed. "Look at that," Miguel said softly. "It's just a baby." Jake felt tears prick his eyes as he watched the desperate hunger with which the cub consumed its first real meal in days. This was what Carol would have seen immediately, not the predator it might become, but the vulnerable infant it was right. Now, after feeding, the cub settled back under the heat lamp with what could only be described as contentment. Its breathing was steadier, and some of the desperate edge had left its amber eyes. For the first time since Jake had found it, the animal looked like it might actually survive. "Jefe," Miguel said, as they prepared to leave the shed for the night, "I have to ask, what's the endgame here? We can't keep a mountain lion indefinitely." Jake looked back at the sleeping cub, so small and fragile under the yellow glow of the heat lamp. I don't know, Miguel. I honest to God don't know. But tonight, it's alive and warm and fed. Tomorrow we'll figure out tomorrow. As they walked back toward the house, Miguel's wife Maria called from the porch to announce that dinner was ready. She had been cooking for the ranch crew for over a decade, treating Jake like the brother she had never had. Tonight, her voice carried the warm invitation of family, a reminder of the human connections that made the isolation of ranch life bearable. But as Jake washed his hands at the kitchen sink, he found himself thinking not of the evening's conversation or Maria's excellent cooking, but of a small mountain lion sleeping peacefully in a converted shed, trusting completely in the goodness of humans who were far from certain they deserved such trust. Dr. Sarah Whitman arrived at the Double J Ranch 3 days later, her veterinary truck raising dust clouds in the early morning light. Jake had called her with a carefully vague request for help with an unusual animal care situation, and to her credit, she had asked no questions beyond scheduling the visit. Sarah was 34, a Colorado State graduate who had chosen rural practice over the more lucrative opportunities available in larger cities. She possessed the kind of practical intelligence that Jake respected, combined with a genuine love for animals that reminded him of Carol. Over the years, she had earned his trust through her work with his cattle and horses, never rushing to judgment or offering simple solutions to complex problems. "All right, Jake," she said as she pulled on her examination gloves. "Show me what we're dealing with." The cub had grown noticeably stronger in the 3 days since its rescue. Regular feeding had restored some vitality to its movements, though it remained far too thin for a healthy animal of its age. More significantly, it had begun to respond to Jake's voice, perking up when he approached and settling more easily when he spoke in low, soothing tones. Sarah's initial reaction was professionally controlled, but Jake caught the quick intake of breath as she saw the mountain lion cub for the first time. "Jake Miller," she said quietly, "what have you gotten yourself into?" "Something that probably violates half a dozen state regulations," Jake admitted, "but I couldn't leave it to die." Sarah conducted her examination with the thorough competence Jake had come to expect from her. The cub, perhaps sensing the veterinarian's gentle nature, remained calm throughout the process. When she finally sat back on her heels, her expression was thoughtful rather than alarmed. "Physically, it's in better shape than I expected, given the circumstances you described," she said. "Malnourished, obviously, but no signs of disease or serious injury. Age-wise, I'd guess 4 to 5 months. Old enough to have been learning to hunt with its mother, but still completely dependent on her for survival. What are its chances?" Jake asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "With proper care, good. Mountain lion cubs are remarkably resilient when they're not fighting starvation." Sarah paused, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "But Jake, you understand the legal implications of what you're doing here?" Jake nodded slowly. "I've been researching that. Fish and Wildlife doesn't exactly have a protocol for temporary care of orphaned mountain lions by private citizens." "No, they don't, and there's a reason for that." Sarah's voice carried no judgment, only concern. "Mountain lions aren't dogs, Jake. They don't domesticate. Even hand-raised animals retain their predatory instincts, and they grow into apex predators capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves." "I know that," Jake said quietly. "I'm not trying to make a pet out of it. I'm just trying to keep it alive until we can figure out a better solution." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the cub as it played with a piece of rope Miguel had provided for enrichment. "There are facilities, wildlife sanctuaries, that specialize in big cats. Most are in other states, but they exist. The problem is transportation and acceptance policies. Many won't take animals that have had extensive human contact. So what you're telling me is that the act of saving its life might have made it impossible to place somewhere appropriate for its long-term care." "It's possible, yes." Sarah met his eyes directly. "Jake, I have to ask, what's your long-term plan here? Because figuring it out as we go isn't sustainable when you're dealing with a predator that's going to weigh 150 pounds in 2 years. Jake looked at the cub, which had settled down for a nap in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the shed's single window. In sleep it looked utterly peaceful, innocent of the complications its presence was creating. "I don't have a long-term plan," he admitted. "Every rational part of me knows this is unsustainable. But Sarah, I keep thinking about what Carol would have done. She never could turn away from something that needed help, regardless of the complications." Sarah's expression softened. She had known Carol, had treated the couple's animals for years before cancer claimed Jake's wife. "Carol was a remarkable woman," she said gently, "but she also would have wanted you to be realistic about the challenges ahead." Over the following week, Jake found himself settling into a routine that revolved around the cub's care. Morning, feedings before dawn, afternoon socialization periods where he simply sat with the animal, evening meals that were gradually incorporating more solid food. Miguel helped when he could, but it was clear that the cub had bonded primarily with Jake. The bonding was mutual, though Jake was reluctant to admit it even to himself. The cub's obvious pleasure at his arrival, the way it would curl up near him during feeding times, the soft purring sounds it made when content, all of these behaviors triggered protective instincts that Jake hadn't felt since Sarah was small. Was Carlos, who inadvertently created their first real crisis. Despite explicit instructions about discretion, the young man mentioned the rescue cat to his girlfriend during a phone conversation that was overheard by her younger brother. Within 2 days, rumors were circulating through town about Jake, Miller's unusual pet. Sheriff Tom Bradley called on a Thursday afternoon, his tone carefully professional. "Jake, I'm getting some interesting reports about activities on your ranch. Thought I might drive out and have a chat." Jake met the sheriff at the front gate, hoping to keep the conversation away from the shed where the cub was housed. Tom Bradley was 55, a career law enforcement officer who had known Jake for over 20 years. They had served together on the school board, shared coffee at the diner in town, attended each other's family celebrations. The friendship made this conversation both easier and more difficult. "Tom," Jake said, shaking the sheriff's hand, "what brings you out this way?" "Well, Jake, I'm hearing some pretty wild stories. Something about you taking in a mountain lion." Tom's expression was carefully neutral, but Jake could see the concern in his eyes. "Please tell me these are just rumors that got out of hand." Jake was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. He could deny everything, claim the rumors were exaggerated accounts of helping an injured deer or some other innocuous wildlife encounter. Tom might accept that explanation, might choose not to investigate further out of respect for their friendship. But looking at the sheriff's face, Jake realized that Tom already knew the truth. Small communities had their own intelligence networks, and Carlos's girlfriend's brother had probably provided more details than Jake would have liked. "It's not what you think, Tom," Jake said finally. "Then help me understand what it is, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're harboring a predator without proper permits, licenses, or facilities." Tom's voice remained friendly, but there was an official edge to it that hadn't been there before. "It's a cub, Tom. Orphaned, half-starved when I found it. I couldn't just leave it to die. And I respect that, Jake. I really do. But this isn't a stray dog we're talking about. This is a protected species, and there are protocols for this kind of situation." The conversation with Sheriff Bradley stretched into the afternoon, taking place not in the comfort of Jake's kitchen, as such discussions usually did, but standing in the dusty ranch yard where their words couldn't be overheard by curious ears. Tom's radio crackled occasionally with routine calls from town, reminders that the outside world continued to function, while Jake's carefully ordered life grew increasingly complicated. "Jake," Tom said, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his forehead, "I've known you for 20 years. You're not reckless, and you're not stupid. So help me understand how you ended up in this situation." Jake looked toward the shed where the cub was likely sleeping through the heat of the day, In the week since his rescue, the animal had begun to show real signs of recovery. Its coat was gaining luster, its movements becoming more fluid and confident. The transformation was remarkable and terrifying. Sometimes doing the right thing and doing the legal thing aren't the same thing, Jake said quietly. I found that. Cub dying, Tom. Not sick, not injured. Dying of starvation. What was I supposed to do? Leave it there and drive away? You were supposed to call Fish and Wildlife, Tom replied, though his tone suggested he understood the inadequacy of that. Answer. Let them handle it according to established protocols. And what would those protocols have been? Euthanasia. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Possibly. Probably. Mountain lion cubs without mothers don't have many options in the wild, and they represent potential problems for human safety if they survive. So I was supposed to let it die to avoid potential future problems. Jake, I'm not saying it's a good system. I'm saying it's the system we have. Tom's voice carried the frustration of a man caught between personal understanding and professional obligation. And right now, you're operating outside that system in ways that could create serious legal problems for you. Jake pulled out his leather journal, a gesture that had become habitual when he needed time to think. The pages were filling with observations about the cub's progress, dietary requirements, behavioral changes. Each entry represented his growing investment in an animal that, according to law and logic, he had no business caring for. Tom, let me ask you something, Jake said, closing the journal. You have grandchildren. If you found one of them in trouble, real trouble, would you wait for official protocols to kick in, or would you act? That's not the same thing, and you know it. Isn't it? We're talking about a young creature that can't survive on its own. The fact that it's a mountain lion instead of a human child doesn't make its need for help any less real. Tom studied Jake's face with the careful attention of someone trying to read beneath surface words. This isn't just about rescue anymore, is it? You've gotten attached to that animal. The accusation hit closer to home than Jake was comfortable admitting. Over the past week, his daily routine had reorganized itself around the cub's needs. He found himself looking forward to feeding times, to the brief periods when the young mountain lion would allow him to sit nearby without retreating to the far corner of its enclosure. The animal's obvious intelligence and growing trust had created an emotional bond that Jake hadn't anticipated. I'm providing temporary care until a permanent solution can be found, Jake said. But even he could hear the defensive tone in his voice. Jake. Tom's voice gentled, taking on the quality of concerned friend rather than law enforcement officer. I've seen this before. Not with mountain lions, but with other wild animals that people try to help. It never ends well. Either the animal gets taken away and probably destroyed, or it grows up and someone gets hurt. There's no happy ending here. Maybe not. But there's also no acceptable alternative. Tom was quiet for several minutes, looking out across the ranch that had been in Jake's family for 3 generations. Finally, he spoke. I can give you some time. Not much, but some. Fish and Wildlife is going to hear about this eventually, probably sooner rather than later. When they do, they'll want to inspect your facilities and evaluate the animal. If they determine it's healthy enough for relocation, that might be your best-case scenario. And if they determine it's too habituated to humans for relocation, Tom's silence was answer enough. That evening, Jake sat in the shed with the cub for longer than usual, watching as the young animal played with increasing confidence and energy. Its recovery had been remarkable, a testament to the resilience of youth and the healing power of consistent care. But Tom's warnings echoed in Jake's mind, mixing with his own growing doubts about the wisdom of what he was doing. Miguel found him there as the last light faded from the western sky. Brooding isn't going to solve anything, Jefe. I keep thinking about what Carol would do, Jake said without looking up. She always seemed to know the right thing, even in impossible situations. Carol would tell you that loving something sometimes means letting it go, Miguel replied gently. Even when letting go breaks your heart. Jake knew his friend was right, but knowing and accepting were different things entirely. The cub had begun to respond to its name, Phoenix, which Jake had started using without quite realizing. When the informal designation became permanent, it would come when called, at least within the confines of its enclosure. It showed obvious pleasure in Jake's company and distress when he was absent for extended periods. Miguel, what if we're wrong about all this? What if there's a way to give it a good life without putting anyone in danger? Miguel sat down beside him, his presence a comfort born of years of shared challenges and mutual respect. Maybe there is, amigo, but you're not going to find that way by keeping it in a shed behind your barn. This animal needs more than you can provide, and deep down, you know that. Phoenix approached them cautiously, drawn by the sound of familiar voices. The cub had grown noticeably in the past week, its movements more coordinated and powerful. Jake could see hints of the formidable predator it would become, but in moments like this, all he saw was a young animal that trusted him completely. Dr. Whitman called this afternoon, Miguel continued. She's been researching facilities that might be able to take Phoenix. There's a sanctuary in Colorado that specializes in big cats. They have experience with hand-raised animals, and they're willing to evaluate Phoenix for possible placement. But they want to see current medical records, behavioral assessments, and documentation of human contact levels. Jake felt something twist in his chest. Intellectually, he knew that placement in a proper facility would be the best outcome for Phoenix. The cub would have adequate space, appropriate diet, and professional care from people who understood its needs better than he ever could. But emotionally, the thought of losing this unexpected connection felt like losing a piece of himself. When? Jake asked quietly. They can send someone next week, if we give them the go-ahead. Phoenix settled down near Jake's feet, the warm weight of its body a reminder of how much had changed in such a short time. The cub's amber eyes reflected the last light from the shed's single bulb, holding an intelligence and awareness that made Jake's decision even more difficult. Set it up, Jake said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. Let's see what they have to say. The Wildlife Sanctuary evaluator arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a woman in her 40s with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years working with dangerous animals. She carried herself with the kind of professional competence that Jake immediately respected, though her presence meant the beginning of the end of his time with Phoenix. Jake had spent the previous evening with the cub, trying to memorize the small details he had come to treasure. The way Phoenix would tilt his head when listening to unfamiliar sounds, the soft rumbling purr he made when content, the graceful way he moved despite his still developing coordination. The young mountain lion had grown significantly in the 3 weeks since his rescue, his coat now lustrous and his movements increasingly confident. Dr. Martinez conducted her evaluation with methodical thoroughness, taking photographs, measurements, and extensive notes on Phoenix's behavior and physical condition. Jake watched from outside the enclosure as she interacted with the cub, noting how Phoenix responded to her presence with curiosity rather than fear. He's remarkably well socialized, Dr. Martinez observed, as Phoenix cautiously approached her. Extended hand, no signs of stress or aggression. You've done excellent work with his rehabilitation. Jake felt a mixture of pride and sorrow at her words. Will your facility be able to take him? Based on what I'm seeing, yes. He's healthy, alert, and while he's comfortable with humans, he hasn't lost his essential wildness. With proper management, he should adapt well to sanctuary life. As they spoke, Carlos Santos came running across the ranch yard, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. Jake, Miguel needs you at the north pasture right away. Something's wrong with the cattle. Jake's immediate instinct was to respond to the emergency, but he hesitated, reluctant to leave during Phoenix's evaluation. Dr. Martinez waved him away. Go handle your ranch business. I'll continue my assessment and we can discuss placement details when you return. The ride to the north pasture revealed a scene that Jake had never encountered in 40 years of ranching. 15 head of cattle were clustered together in the center of the field, clearly agitated and stressed. Miguel stood near his truck, studying the tree line with binoculars. "What's the situation?" Jake asked as he dismounted. "Something spooked them early this morning," Miguel replied, handing over the binoculars. "Carlos found them like this when he came to check the water levels. Look at the fence line near those cottonwoods." Jake focused the binoculars and felt his blood run cold. The fence wire had been torn apart, not cut or damaged by weather, but ripped as if by something with tremendous strength. More disturbing were the large paw prints, clearly visible in the soft earth near the damaged section. "Mountain lion," Jake said quietly. "A big one," Miguel confirmed. "Probably a mature female based on the size of those tracks." Jake's mind raced through the implications. Adult mountain lions occasionally passed through ranch land, but they rarely bothered with cattle unless they were desperate or protecting territory. The proximity to where he had found Phoenix suddenly took on new significance. "Miguel," Jake said slowly, "what if Phoenix wasn't truly orphaned? What if his mother was still alive when I found him?" Miguel's expression grew grave as he considered the possibility. "You think she's been looking for him?" It would explain why he was in such bad shape. If something separated them, injury, human interference, territorial disputes with other cats, the mother might have been unable to return to her den. She could have been searching for weeks. The radio clipped to Miguel's belt crackled to life. Carlos's voice came through, tight with urgency. "Tio Miguel, you need to get back here now. There's a mountain lion near the ranch buildings. Jake." And Miguel exchanged a look of shared understanding before racing back toward the ranch. As they crested the hill that overlooked the main buildings, Jake's worst fears were confirmed. A large female mountain lion sat approximately 50 yards from the shed where Phoenix was housed, her attention focused entirely on the building. Dr. Martinez stood frozen beside her vehicle, clearly aware that any sudden movement might trigger an attack. She had obviously encountered the cat while conducting her evaluation and had the presence of mind to remain motionless. "That's Phoenix's mother," Jake said with absolute certainty. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same tawny coat, the same intelligent amber eyes, the same elegant build that Jake had grown to recognize in her son. "She's been tracking his scent," Miguel realized, "following it here." As they watched, Phoenix appeared at the window of his enclosure, drawn by some instinct or scent that humans couldn't detect. The moment he saw his mother, the young cub began, making urgent vocalizations. Not the soft purrs and chirps Jake had become accustomed to, but the wild calls of a mountain lion communicating with its family. The response from the adult cat was immediate and heartbreaking. She rose to her feet and began moving toward the shed, her movements conveying both caution and desperate longing. This was not the behavior of a predator stalking prey, but of a mother who had found her lost child. "Jesus," Miguel whispered. "She's been searching for him all this time." Jake felt something break open in his chest as he watched the reunion unfold. All of his careful justifications for keeping Phoenix, all of his fears about the cub's future, suddenly seemed small and selfish compared to the simple truth playing out before them. Phoenix belonged with his mother, in the wild, living the life nature had intended for him. But the situation was far from simple. The adult mountain lion was showing no fear of human presence, which suggested she had overcome her natural caution. In her desperation to recover her cub, more concerning, she was demonstrating the kind of bold behavior that wildlife officials would interpret as dangerous. "We have to be very careful here," Jake said quietly. "If Fish and Wildlife gets called in, they'll destroy both animals as threats to public safety." Dr. Martinez, apparently realizing that the adults were aware of the situation, began moving slowly toward them, never taking her eyes off the mountain lion. When she reached speaking distance, she whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. The mother has been calling to the cub, and he's responding. The bond is clearly intact." "What do we do?" Jake asked. "Normally, I'd recommend immediate intervention by wildlife authorities. Dr. Martinez replied, "but this changes everything. If we can safely release the cub to its mother, we might be looking at a conservation success story instead of a management problem." As if understanding their conversation, Phoenix began showing signs of extreme agitation, pacing his enclosure and continuously vocalizing to his mother. The adult cat responded by moving closer to the shed, though she maintained her distance from the humans. "She knows we have her baby," Miguel observed. "Question is, does she see us as threats or as the people who saved him?" The answer came in the most unexpected way. Carlos, who had been watching from the safety of the barn, accidentally knocked over a metal bucket, creating a loud crash that echoed across the ranch yard. The sound startled everyone, but instead of fleeing, the mother mountain lion did something extraordinary. She positioned herself directly between the shed containing her cub and the humans, adopting a protective stance that was clearly defensive. Rather than aggressive, she was protecting not just Phoenix, but the entire situation that had allowed for his survival and recovery. "My God," Dr. Martinez breathed. "She understands. She knows we helped him." Jake stared at the magnificent animal, feeling the weight of a revelation that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. This wasn't just about a rescued cub. It was about a family that had been torn apart and was now, against all odds, finding its way back together. But reuniting them would require navigating legal, safety, and practical challenges that made Phoenix's initial rescue seem simple by comparison. And time was running out. Sheriff Bradley would inevitably hear about this development, and once official wheels began turning, the outcome would be out of Jake's hands entirely. The mother mountain lion settled into a patient vigil, her message clear: she wasn't leaving without her son. The question now was whether Jake could find a way to give them both the freedom they deserved. The standoff lasted through the afternoon, with the mother mountain lion maintaining her vigil, while Phoenix grew increasingly agitated in his enclosure. Dr. Martinez had managed to reach her vehicle and was documenting the unprecedented behavior with both written notes and video footage. Recognizing that what they were witnessing might never be seen again, Jake found himself caught between wonder and mounting anxiety. Every hour that passed increased the likelihood that someone would report the situation to authorities, setting in motion a chain of events that would likely end with both animals being destroyed as public safety threats. Word traveled fast in their small community, and the sight of a full-grown mountain lion near ranch buildings would not go unnoticed for long. "We need a plan," Miguel said quietly as they watched from the shelter of the barn. "We can't just wait for someone else to make this decision for us." Jake pulled out his worn leather journal, its pages now filled with observations about Phoenix's recovery and development. Looking at his careful notes, he realized that he had been documenting more than just an animal's rehabilitation. He had been recording the formation of a bond that transcended species boundaries. The thought of that bond being severed by bureaucratic necessity felt like a betrayal of everything he and Phoenix had shared. "Dr. Martinez," Jake called softly, "in your professional opinion, what are the chances of a successful reunion?" The wildlife expert considered the question carefully before responding. "Under normal circumstances, I'd say good. The mother clearly recognizes her offspring, and Phoenix is responding to her calls. The critical factor is whether he still retains enough wild instincts to survive in natural conditions after weeks of human care. And if the reunion fails, then we'd have two dangerous animals in close proximity to human habitation, which would force immediate intervention by state wildlife authorities." Jake understood the implications. Success meant Phoenix would return to his natural life with his mother. Failure would likely mean death sentences for both animals. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. Carlos approached from the house, his face grim. "Jake, my girlfriend just called. Her little brother has been posting about the mountain lions on social media. Says he's got video from this morning." Jake felt his stomach drop. Social media moved at light speed, and sensational content like mountain lion footage would spread rapidly through their community and beyond. They might have hours before the situation spiraled completely out of their control. "How much time do you think we have?" Miguel asked, clearly thinking along the same lines. "Not much," Jake replied. "Tom Bradley will get calls, Fish and Wildlife will get involved, and then our options disappear." Dr. Martinez had been listening to their conversation while keeping one eye on the mountain lions. "If we're going to attempt a reunion, it needs to happen soon. The mother is showing signs of stress, and prolonged separation could affect her." Willingness to accept Phoenix back into her care, Jake made his decision with the clarity that came from knowing there was really no choice at all. "What do we need to do?" "First, we need to ensure our own safety," Dr. Martinez said. "Adult mountain lions are incredibly dangerous, even when their intentions aren't aggressive. Second, we need to create conditions that give Phoenix the best chance of successfully transitioning back to wild behavior." The next hour was spent in careful preparation. Miguel cleared the area around the shed of anything that might pose obstacles or dangers during the reunion. Carlos was stationed at the house with instructions to call for help if the situation turned dangerous. Dr. Martinez positioned herself with clear escape routes and communication equipment. Jake found himself alone with Phoenix for what might be the last time. The young mountain lion had grown so much since that first desperate day on the ridge trail. His coat was lustrous, his movements graceful and powerful, his eyes bright with intelligence and health. But beneath the physical transformation, Jake could see the wildness that had never truly been tamed, only temporarily suppressed by circumstances. "You were never really mine, were you?" Jake said quietly, watching as Phoenix paced restlessly near the window, facing his mother. "I was just keeping you safe until she could come back." Phoenix turned at the sound of his voice, amber eyes meeting Jake's, with an expression that seemed almost understanding. For a moment, the young mountain lion approached and rubbed against the enclosure's wall near where Jake stood, a gesture of affection that brought tears to the older man's eyes. "I'm going to miss you," Jake whispered. "More than I probably should." The actual reunion required careful orchestration. Dr. Martinez had researched protocols for similar situations, though she admitted that most wildlife agencies preferred to avoid such scenarios entirely. The key was to minimize human involvement, while ensuring that both animals had clear escape routes if things went wrong. Jake opened Phoenix's enclosure with hands that trembled slightly, whether from fear or emotion he couldn't say. The young mountain lion immediately moved toward the opening, but paused at the threshold, looking back at Jake with what seemed like gratitude or goodbye. "Go on," Jake said softly. "She's waiting for you." Phoenix stepped cautiously into the open air, his movements revealing the instinctive wariness that had been developing beneath his comfortable domesticity. The mother mountain lion rose to her feet as her son emerged, her body language showing excitement tempered by caution. The first contact between mother and son was tentative, mutual sniffing and soft vocalizations that carried across the ranch yard like a conversation in a language humans could recognize but not translate. Then, as if some invisible barrier dissolved, Phoenix rushed to his mother, and she began the grooming behaviors that Jake had read about but never witnessed. "Incredible," Dr. Martinez breathed, recording everything with professional fascination. "The bond is completely intact. It's as if they were never separated." Jake watched the reunion with emotions he couldn't untangle. Joy at seeing Phoenix restored to his natural family, sorrow at losing the companion who had brought unexpected meaning to his quiet life, and a deep satisfaction at knowing he had made the right choice despite its personal cost. The mountain lion's behavior over the next 30 minutes provided compelling evidence that the reunion was successful. Phoenix exhibited increasingly wild behaviors, alert scanning of his environment, response to his mother's subtle communication cues, and a gradual reduction in attention to the humans who had cared for him. It was as if his weeks of human contact were being overwritten by the stronger pull of his genetic heritage. But Jake's moment of quiet celebration was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch. Sheriff Bradley's patrol car led a small convoy that included a fish and wildlife truck and what appeared to be a news van from the regional television station. "Here we go," Miguel said grimly. "Decision time just got made for us." Jake felt a surge of protective anger as he realized that Phoenix and his mother were about to become subjects of official intervention rather than witnesses to a conservation miracle. The young mountain lion, who had shown such trust in human kindness, would now face the institutional machinery that typically viewed predators as problems to be managed rather than individuals deserving of consideration. Dr. Martinez moved quickly to intercept the approaching officials, her professional credentials providing her with authority that Jake lacked. "Dr. Martinez, wildlife biologist," she announced, extending her hand to the fish and wildlife officer. "I've been documenting this situation for the past several hours, and I have some significant observations to share." Jake could hear fragments of the conversation, words like unprecedented behavior, conservation opportunity, and public safety assessment. But his attention remained focused on Phoenix and his mother, who had detected the arrival of additional humans and were showing signs of stress. The mother mountain lion had positioned herself protectively near her son, both animals now fully alert to the changed dynamics around them. Phoenix, caught between his weeks of human socialization and his instinctive response to his mother's wariness, seemed confused and conflicted. "They need to leave," Jake said to Miguel. "All this activity is going to undo everything we've accomplished." But even as he spoke, Jake realized that the decision was no longer his to make. Official protocols were now in effect, and the fate of both mountain lions would be determined by regulations and procedures that had no room for the emotional bonds that had brought them to this moment. Sheriff Bradley approached, his expression mixing official duty with personal regret. "Jake, I'm sorry it's come to this, but we've got reports of aggressive mountain lion behavior, public safety concerns, and media attention. My hands are tied." Jake looked one last time at Phoenix, memorizing. The sight of the young mountain lion pressed close to his mother's side. In that moment, he made a decision that would determine not just the animal's fate, but his own peace of mind for years to come. "Tom," Jake said quietly, "give me 5 minutes. 5 minutes to show you something that might change how this whole situation gets handled." The sheriff hesitated, clearly torn between friendship and duty. "Jake, I don't know if I can—" "5 minutes, Tom. For Carol's memory and for the chance to do something right in a world that doesn't often give us that opportunity." Sheriff Bradley looked at the mountain lions, then at Jake's face, and finally nodded. 5 minutes. But if anything goes wrong, this ends immediately." Jake walked slowly toward the mountain lions, his movements deliberate and calm, despite the weight of multiple sets of eyes watching his every step. Phoenix and his mother had retreated slightly at the arrival of the officials, but they hadn't fled, a fact that Jake hoped would prove significant to the assembled observers. "Jake, what are you doing?" Sheriff Bradley called out, his voice tight with concern. "Showing you the truth," Jake replied without turning around. "About trust, about bonds, and about what's really at stake here." As Jake approached, Phoenix lifted his head, and their eyes met across 20 feet of ranch yard. The young mountain lion's amber gaze held recognition, familiarity, and something that looked remarkably like affection. Without any sign of fear or aggression, Phoenix rose and began walking toward Jake. The reaction from the watching officials was immediate and alarmed. "Sir, step back!" the fish and wildlife officer shouted. "Do not approach the animal!" But Jake continued forward, extending his hand as he had done dozens of times over the past month during feeding sessions. Phoenix approached without hesitation, rubbing his head against Jake's palm in a gesture of greeting that was both wild and deeply personal. "My God," Dr. Martinez whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. The level of trust is extraordinary. The mother mountain lion watched this interaction with what appeared to be calm acceptance rather than protective aggression. She seemed to understand that Jake posed no threat to her son, indeed that he was responsible for Phoenix's healthy condition and safe return to her care. Jake knelt slowly, bringing himself to Phoenix's level. The young mountain lion settled beside him, close enough that Jake could feel the warmth of his body and hear the soft, rumbling purr that indicated contentment. For these few moments, with officials and cameras watching, Jake demonstrated the profound bond that had developed. Between human and wild animal, "This is what you're planning to destroy," Jake said, his voice carrying across the yard to the assembled group. "Not a dangerous predator, not a threat to public safety, but a relationship built on mutual respect and care." The Fish and Wildlife officer, a serious-looking woman in her 30s, approached cautiously. "Mr. Miller, I understand your attachment to this animal, but regulations exist for good reasons. Mountain lions cannot be kept as pets regardless of the circumstances of their rescue." "I'm not asking to keep him as a pet," Jake replied, his hand still resting on Phoenix's flank. "Look around you. Do you see an animal that's being held captive?" Indeed, both Phoenix and his mother were free to leave at any time. They remained near the shed, not because they were trapped, but because this had become a place of safety and reunion rather than confinement. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her professional expertise lending weight to her words. "Officer, what we're witnessing here is unprecedented in my experience. This cub has maintained his wild instincts while developing trust with his human caretaker. The mother has accepted the human involvement in her offspring's rescue. This isn't a case of dangerous habituation. It's an example of successful rehabilitation." "Dr. Martinez," the officer replied, "I respect your experience, but these animals are now showing reduced fear of humans, which by definition makes them potential public safety risks." Jake felt Phoenix tense slightly at the stern voices and rising tension. The young mountain lion was picking up on the stress of the situation, caught between his trust in Jake and his instinctive response to his mother's growing wariness. "Phoenix," Jake said softly, using the name he had given the cub during their weeks together, "it's time for you to go home." As if understanding the words, Phoenix looked toward his mother, then back at Jake. The young mountain lion made a soft sound, part purr, part questioning call, that seemed to ask for clarification about what was expected of him. Jake stood slowly, not wanting to startle either mountain lion with sudden movements. "Your mother's been looking for you. She's found you now. You don't need me anymore." Phoenix approached his mother, who had been watching the entire interaction with remarkable calm. She nuzzled her son briefly, then looked directly at Jake with an expression that seemed almost like acknowledgement or gratitude. Sheriff Bradley moved closer, his hand resting on his radio, but not yet making the call that would bring in additional units and tranquilizer equipment. "Jake, whatever you're trying to prove here, you've made your point, but we still have to follow protocol." "Tom," Jake said, never taking his eyes off the mountain lions, "what if the protocol is wrong? What if there's a better way to handle situations like this than the one-size-fits-all approach that ends with destruction?" The question hung in the air as the small group watched Phoenix and his mother begin to move away from the ranch buildings. Their departure wasn't hurried or panicked, but rather the deliberate movement of animals who had accomplished what they came to do. "They're leaving," Dr. Martinez observed with obvious relief. "The reunion was successful. The mother is leading her cub back to their natural territory." Jake felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he watched Phoenix follow his mother toward the tree line. The young mountain lion paused once to look back, and Jake raised his hand in a gesture of farewell that felt both final and eternal. Phoenix paused at the edge of the clearing, his amber eyes meeting Jake's one final time across the distance that now separated them. In that moment, Jake saw not the desperate, starving cub he had rescued weeks ago, but a magnificent young predator ready to reclaim his place in the wild. The transformation was complete, and it was beautiful. The mother mountain lion waited patiently for her son, her presence a calm constant that had guided the entire reunion. When Phoenix finally turned away from the ranch and followed her into the cottonwoods, Jake felt something fundamental shift inside him, a letting go that was both loss and liberation. "They're heading north," Dr. Martinez observed, tracking their movement through binoculars, toward the higher country where they're less likely to encounter human activity. "That's exactly what we'd hoped to see." The Fish and Wildlife officer lowered her radio, the call for backup units apparently unnecessary now that the immediate situation had resolved itself. "Mr. Miller, what you accomplished here was remarkable, but it was also incredibly risky. Wild animals are unpredictable, and the fact that this ended well doesn't validate the approach." Jake understood her position, but he also understood something she perhaps could not, that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was abandoning responsibility for the consequences of human intervention in natural processes. "Officer, 3 weeks ago I found a dying animal and made a choice to help. Today, that same animal returned to his natural family in better condition than when I found him. I understand that this doesn't follow standard protocols, but sometimes the right thing and the regulatory thing aren't the same." Sheriff Bradley approached, his official demeanor softened by obvious relief that the situation had ended without violence or tragedy. "Jake, you know I have to file a report about this. There will be questions from state wildlife authorities, possibly fines or other administrative consequences." "I understand, Tom. I'm prepared to face whatever comes next." Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her professional credentials carrying weight with all the assembled officials. "Sheriff, officer, I'd like to formally recommend that this case be treated as a successful wildlife rehabilitation rather than a violation of custody regulations. Mr. Miller provided temporary care that directly resulted in the successful reunion of a mother and offspring. The outcome represents a conservation success story that deserves recognition rather than punishment." The Fish and Wildlife officer considered this perspective, clearly weighing precedent against practical results. "Dr. Martinez, your recommendation will be noted in my report. However, this situation cannot be used as justification for future private citizens attempting similar interventions." "Understood," Jake replied, "but I hope it might encourage officials to consider more flexible approaches when circumstances warrant them." As the officials conducted their final interviews and prepared to leave, Miguel approached Jake with something that looked like pride mixed with relief. "Amigo, what you did here, it took courage. Not everyone would have risked so much for an animal that could never really belong to them." Jake looked toward the tree line where Phoenix and his mother had disappeared, feeling the absence of the young mountain lion like a physical ache. "He was never mine to keep, Miguel. I was just providing temporary care until his real family could reclaim him. But the bond you formed, that was real. Yes, it was real. And that's exactly why letting him go was the right thing to do." Carlos, who had witnessed the entire reunion from the safety of the house, approached with uncharacteristic solemnity. "Jake, I'm sorry about putting this on social media. I didn't understand what it might mean for Phoenix and his mother." Jake placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, recognizing an opportunity to teach rather than blame. "Carlos, what happened here today should remind all of us that our actions have consequences we might not anticipate. Sometimes those consequences affect not just ourselves, but innocent creatures who depend on our wisdom and compassion." As the sun began to set behind the western mesas, painting the canyon walls in familiar shades of amber and rust, Jake found himself alone in the shed where Phoenix had spent his weeks of recovery. The space felt empty now, marked by the absence of the small life that had brought such unexpected meaning to Jake's carefully ordered existence. He pulled out his leather journal and began to write, documenting not just the facts of what had occurred, but the emotional journey that had transformed him from a lonely widower into someone capable of profound love and necessary sacrifice. "Today, I learned that love sometimes means letting go," he wrote in his careful handwriting. "Phoenix returned to his mother and his natural life, where he belongs. I will miss him more than words can express, but I am grateful for the time we shared and for the reminder that unexpected connections can heal hearts we thought were permanently broken." Jake closed the journal and walked out into the gathering darkness, where thunder waited patiently to carry him home. The horse nuzzled his shoulder gently, as if understanding that his rider needed comfort after an emotionally difficult day. As they rode back toward the house, Jake heard a sound that made his heart race, the distant call of a mountain lion echoing across the canyon. It might have been Phoenix or his mother or some other cat entirely. But to Jake, it sounded like a song of gratitude, a wild voice saying goodbye and thank you across the vast landscape they both loved. The sound faded into the night, but the memory of it and of everything that had led to this moment would remain with Jake for the rest of his life. 6 months later, Jake Miller guided Thunder along the same ridge trail where he had first encountered Phoenix. The autumn air carried hints of the winter to come, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned, brilliant gold against the Red Rock Canyon walls. It was the kind of morning that reminded a man why he had chosen to spend his life in this magnificent and challenging country. The worn leather journal in his shirt pocket contained new entries now. Observations about wildlife movements, weather patterns, and the gradual healing of his own heart. The pages documenting Phoenix's recovery and release had become some of the most treasured in the entire collection, a record of transformation that applied as much to Jake himself as to the young mountain lion he had briefly sheltered. Dr. Martinez had visited twice since the reunion, sharing updates from her ongoing research into human-wildlife conflict resolution. Phoenix and his mother had been spotted several times by trail cameras in the high country, always together, always moving with the confident grace of animals perfectly adapted to their environment. The young mountain lion had grown substantially, his coat thick and lustrous as he prepared for his first winter as a truly wild animal. "He's thriving," Dr. Martinez had reported during her last visit. "No signs of human dependence or problematic behavior. The rehabilitation was a complete success." The official aftermath had been surprisingly positive. Fish and Wildlife authorities, influenced by Dr. Martinez's detailed report and the undeniable success of Phoenix's return to the wild, had decided against pursuing charges. Instead, they had quietly incorporated Jake's experience into their developing protocols for similar situations, recognizing that rigid adherence to standard procedures sometimes prevented optimal outcomes. Sheriff Bradley had become a regular visitor to the ranch, often stopping by for coffee and conversation that had deepened their friendship. "You taught us all something important that day," he had told Jake recently. "Sometimes the right thing to do isn't found in any manual or regulation. Sometimes it requires the kind of judgment that comes from understanding rather than authority." Miguel had taken to calling Jake El Hombre del León, the Lion Man, with a mixture of affection and respect that spoke to how the experience had changed their working relationship. The older man's willingness to risk everything for a suffering animal had elevated him in Miguel's eyes, from boss to something approaching a mentor in matters of the heart as well as ranch management. Carlos had learned his own lessons from the experience, becoming more thoughtful about the consequences of his actions and more appreciative of the complex relationships between humans and the natural world. His girlfriend's brother, whose social media posts had nearly created disaster, had since become one of the most vocal advocates for wildlife conservation in their small community. The empty shed behind the barn had been converted into a workshop, where Jake had taken up woodworking, crafting furniture and small sculptures with the same patience and attention to detail he had once devoted to Phoenix's care. The work occupied his hands while allowing his mind to wander, often to memories of amber eyes and soft purring sounds that had brought such unexpected joy to his quiet life. Sarah had visited from Denver with her children shortly after Phoenix's release, drawn by the remarkable story her father had shared over the phone. She had listened with growing amazement as Jake described the weeks of care, the mother's return, and the difficult decision to let Phoenix return to his wild family. "Dad," she had said as they sat on the porch watching her children play in the ranch yard, "you've changed. There's something different about you since Mom died, but this brought back something I thought was gone forever." Jake understood what she meant. The experience with Phoenix had awakened parts of himself that grief had temporarily buried. His capacity for deep connection, his willingness to take emotional risks, his faith in the possibility of healing and renewal. Carol would have loved Phoenix, would have seen immediately what Jake had taken time to recognize, that love could exist without possession, that care could transcend species, and that the greatest gift sometimes came disguised as the most challenging. Responsibilities. The ranch continued its rhythms of seasonal work and daily maintenance, but Jake found himself more attuned to the wildlife that shared the land. He had installed motion-activated cameras at several locations, not for security, but for the simple pleasure of observing the secret lives of animals who moved through his property. Deer, elk, coyotes, and occasionally bears appeared in the footage, reminders of the rich ecosystem that existed beyond human awareness. On this particular morning, as Jake paused to let Thunder drink from the familiar stream, he noticed fresh tracks in the soft earth beside the water. Large paw prints, clearly feline, pressed into the mud where some creature had come to drink during the night. Jake studied them carefully, noting their size and spacing, feeling his heart rate quicken with possibility. The tracks could belong to any number of mountain lions that moved through this territory, but something about their placement, their confident stride, reminded him of a particular amber-eyed cat who had once trusted him completely before choosing freedom over safety. Jake pulled out his journal and made careful notes about the tracks, their location, and the conditions that had preserved them. Whether they belonged to Phoenix or some other mountain lion didn't really matter. What mattered was that they represented the continuation of wildlife in a landscape increasingly dominated by human activity. As Thunder finished drinking, and they prepared to continue their ride, Jake heard it, a distant call echoing across the canyon. The voice of a mountain lion, clear and strong, carrying across the vast spaces between mesa and sky. It might have been territorial communication, or mating calls, or simply the expression of pure wildness that needed no human interpretation. But, to Jake, it sounded like gratitude, like remembrance, like the voice of a young animal who had learned that humans could be sources of help rather than harm, and who carried that knowledge into a wildlife that was richer for the brief connection they had shared. Jake smiled and touched the brim of his hat in salute to the unseen caller, before guiding Thunder up the trail toward home. The bond he had formed with Phoenix lived on, not in possession or proximity, but in the knowledge that love expressed through sacrifice could create connections that transcended the boundaries between species and lasted far beyond the brief time they were able to share the same space. The canyon held its secrets, but it also held its gifts, and Jake Miller rode through its ancient beauty with a heart that had been broken, healed, and made larger by the experience of loving something. Enough to let it go.